Link to the past? No. Link to the USB, as in Corsair Link. The Corsair Link on the H110i GTX and the RM1000i. We're going to take a look. Now, you may have seen these in our editor build, or maybe we haven't posted our editor build video. We use these in an X99 editor machine that was put in the teeny tiny Lee & Lee PCA51. It's one of the smallest full ATX cases you can get. Now, ever since last year when we went to Computex and we did the video with Johnny Guru about how they've set up the Corsair power supplies, I've really wanted to get my hands on a power supply. And since we were doing this sort of overpowered editor build that may actually get SLI graphics, is used for HDMI video capture, and we also case modded the PCA51 because I wanted to move around the power supply a little bit. I really thought this would be a good choice of a power supply to actually take a look at, because you can configure how the rails are, for example. So if you're a single rail person, you can totally do that. Although I think Johnny Guru has convinced me that multi-rail power supplies are the way to go. So that's maybe something interesting. And then we've also got the GTX 110i. Now the GTX 110i I actually got to look at with Skylake, but I thought it was so extreme maximum overkill with Skylake that I ended up going back to the 5960X and overclocking it to see what it could do. And I've been very impressed. So when I'll confess, when I first saw the GTX 110i with the giant tubes that connect the pump to the radiator, I thought, surely that's just aesthetic. And the radiator said, don't call me Shirley. So I thought I would have to take a look and put it through its paces. Now the GTX 110i is one of the best closed loop water coolers that I've ever tested. Now granted, I haven't tested a lot. Certainly historically the H100 and the H100i are closed loop coolers that I've put through the paces. And I really like Corsair's policy of if the all-in-one cooler leaks and destroys all your stuff and it wasn't your fault that it leaked, then we'll help you replace all your stuff. Historically, their stance on that has been really cool. I think that's still in effect as far as I know. I knew someone that had an H100 that actually leaked. It didn't cause any damage or anything, but Corsair support handled it really well. And, I was not involved. I heard about it later after the fact. It was like, oh yeah, I called them up and they had me send pictures, and the fluid that came out of it was sort of an off-color fluid, and he answered some questions and took some more pictures, and then they were like, oh, we're really sorry, this is a very small issue, very small number of things affected. You got to keep in mind Corsair is one of the largest, if not the largest, all-in-one reseller that's out there, and so I've sort of been impressed with what they've been doing the last few generations. And so I saw this one and I said, wow, these tubes are huge. I don't understand. I mean, the aesthetic here is really cool. I love the aesthetic, but overall, I'm not really sure about the particulars of if that actually increases cooling, or if that actually helps it a bunch, or is the performance all in the pump, or where is the performance improvement here? So let's take a look at what you get in the H110i GTX box. I'm going to keep calling it the GTX 110. I don't know why, but it's the H110i GTX. So inside the box, you get the closed loop cooler. Of course, it's all pre-assembled and put together for you. You get two fans. These are the low noise Corsair fans, and I'm happy to report that they are in fact actually low noise. The PCA51 case from Lee & Lee is sort of a worst case scenario in terms of noise generation, which is why the fans that it comes with have rubber mounts to help silence them. So when you're going to do something like this, it helps if you have little strips of rubber or whatever that you're mounting this with in order to make it a little bit quieter, because the very thin aluminum case doesn't do you any favors in terms of noise reduction. And so with that particular case, you really want to use grommets everywhere. But in that worst case scenario, I'm happy to report that the pump noise and the fan noise from this thing was actually minimal. So that's very good. It also comes with a mounting kit for everything under the sun. If you want to use, Haswell Skylake X99, pretty much anything on the AMD platform, you're good to go as far as a mounting kit goes for this. It also comes with extra screws and different length screws depending on how you want to mount it to give you some mounting options. If you want to do a push-pull configuration, it does come with the screws so that you can use another set of fans with this if you so desire. Now for me, a closed-loop cooler, there's only really two questions. What's its cooling capacity, and how loud is it? If it's at that certain frequency that tickles the inside of your ear, it's like tickling your brain in a bad way. And if it has that hum, then, that's it. It's over. I'm really actually surprised. The pump on this, it was very hard to detect noise from this over top of the regular case fan noise from the other cooling fans in this particular setup. So for the editor build, we actually turned the fan off on the Corsair RM1000i, because that's an option. If you're going to be less than 400 watts, the fan doesn't even come on on the RM1000i, so turn the fan off, and basically shoved a microphone inside the case to see a directional microphone, the Rode, to see if we could pick up anything from the pump. And then, sort of stop fans with my fingers and just see what the noise is. There is a little bit of a pump noise, but it is absolutely minimal. If you have any sort of modern case or any kind of case with any kind of sound dampening, unless you are sitting with your case on your shoulder like a 1980s style boombox, I don't believe you're going to hear the pump from this thing. It's very, very quiet. Now, if you're looking to get 2 matching fans, the specific model number, the fans that it come with, are the SP140L. So now that we know that this pump does not, in fact, have one of those pumps that has a high-pitched whine that eats your brain, and is perfectly satisfactory and very good, what's the other big question? Well, what's its cooling capacity? Well, I'm sorry to say that when I was testing this on Skylake, I couldn't get the Skylake hot enough, even at 1.4 volts, for this thing not to keep up. I had to move up to the 5960X. Yeah, I might have, that Skylake chip has not been acting right since I did that either. It now, the Skylake chip, I pushed it a little too hard, and now it's an interesting situation where the memory only works in the first and last slot. If you put 2 sticks of memory in any configuration other than the first and last slot on the motherboard, it no longer works. It won't post. If you put 1 stick of RAM in any of the 4 slots, it works. But if you put 1 stick of RAM, like if you put them the way that you're supposed to, it won't post. But if you put 1 stick of RAM in the first slot and 1 stick of RAM in the last slot, it worked. I probably killed that chip. So I moved up to the 5960X to see what it would do and to see how that worked. And I was actually really impressed with the 5960X. So with the 5960X, you actually probably have a little bit more overclocking headroom than you do on Skylake, assuming that your cooler can keep up. And I'm happy to report that the GTX 110i did an amazing job cooling this 5960X. Now this is an editor build, and so it's not going to be overclocked all the time. But with the Sabertooth X99, I was able to save an overclock profile, so I can toggle between the two. So if I'm going to play a game and I don't really care the most about stability, or if I'm going to do something computationally intensive and maybe I don't really care too much about the stability, then I can turn that on. But most of the time for regular editing work and that kind of thing, it's just going to be a mild overclock. But the cooling capacity of this particular pump means that even with the mild overclock, it's still going to be really stable. So with this cooler's cooling capacity and the relatively mild overclock in the 5960X, I really didn't have to bump the voltage very much at all, practically nothing. And that's the thing that can really shorten your CPU's lifetime and do some damage to it. I was able to get this thing stable at about 3.7, 3.8, something like that. It's 3.8, but I'm probably going to have to back it off to 3.7 because there have been a couple of things that I've found. But for day-to-day computing, it's basically stable. And that's with a very, very minor voltage bump. Now that is on the turbo side, so it's not running that frequency all the time. It's not pegged at that frequency all the time. It's still just the offset kind of a deal. But it does actually work and does work well, and it works better than the previous cooler that I was using with this particular CPU and this particular setup. I think it's also a little bit more of a challenge in the PCA 51 because there's really not a lot of air intakes. I've got the radiator in the top, and so it's got to work a little bit harder to pull the air through the system, and it's also pulling in air that has been heated by the rest of the system from the fresh air intakes. It's definitely not optimal from a maximum overclock standpoint, but with the particular fans and how quiet they are and that they're on the outside of the case, I was very satisfied with this particular setup in this case. That being said, I think that these particular components were the best choice for this build. I think the RM1000i power supply is a little overkill without 2 graphics cards. But given that we may have 2 graphics cards, maybe we'll get dual Titans, maybe we'll get dual Furies. I'm not really sure. It's going to be for video production, so I really probably should get a Quadro or a Fire Pro, but those are kind of rare, and I always like modding the old cards like the GTX. The last really successful mod that I had was a mod to the GTX 8800, which made it into a Quadro, and there was basically no side effects with that. That worked really well. I miss those days. It's harder to do that now than it has been historically, but for an editor rig, a Fire Pro or a Quadro is probably a better choice in terms of graphics card. But still, having 1,000 watts at our disposal and being able to run basically whatever we want in terms of an overclock and basically whatever we want in terms of an SLI configuration, but also having that diagnostic information from the Corsair Link and the information about the wattage, the fan speed, being able to tweak that. Maybe the editor build needs to be extra quiet, and it's just going to have to run hot for a while because of a particular setup that we're doing, and I don't want any fan noise, or maybe where I've got the camera set up or whatever. I can control everything, including the power supply fan, through software now, so that's really handy. I'm also really surprised that the pump is as quiet as it is, because I was a little bit worried about it. I mean, this is the machine that I'm using to record the live broadcast, and this is the machine that I'm using to record, all this other stuff. If it's too loud, then that's a little problematic. But I also wanted it to be physically small so that it would be portable. In terms of configurability and customizability, this product does actually come with some options. It's got Corsair Link, which is a USB interface, so you can plug the CPU cooler directly into your motherboard, a USB header, and control the RGB LED and other parameters about how the cooler operates, and also get at its own sensor data, the data that the cooler reports. You can get the data from USB. That works really well. Corsair Link sometimes historically has been a little weird and a little buggy. Not anything bad, but there's just little things that they could do, I think, to make the software interface a little better as far as Corsair Link goes. But overall, it was really handy being able to access the cooler parameters through the Corsair Link software, configure the LED, whatever it is that you want to do. Maybe change the parameters about how the fans operate based on temperature or something like that. The Corsair Link software can also interface with most motherboard interfaces for the fans and temperature as far as that goes. So on our particular setup here, we're using the Sabertooth X99 from Asus, and this motherboard, if you want to see more about the editor build, just go look at the editor build, because you can see us basically construct the system and do the case mod, so you can learn a little bit more about it. But the important thing is that the sensors on that motherboard show up in the Corsair Link software, and so you can do stuff with it. The only thing that's really missing is, I think in the graph area, the configuration in the graph area, there should be an option to add a line, or to add data from the wattage, the CPU wattage. I found myself playing around with AIDA64, turning AIDA64 on and off, looking at the output from a kilowatt, and then looking at the efficiency rating and output wattage as reported by the Corsair Link software to see how those matched up, and it didn't always seem to respond. Like, I would turn on AIDA64 and the software wouldn't always immediately respond with the change in wattage. Still, it was a really useful tool in order to sort of see what was going on in the system from a power level, and actually mess around with some of the lower level parameters. And then here you can see the multi-rail mode on or off is just a toggle. Multi-rail mode on really is just giving you a fuse or an overcurrent protection for the different 12-volt rails. There's really no reason not to use it. So if you want to learn more about that, you really should check out our video with Johnny Guru, which I think is in the description. These components worked out really well in this build, and I'm really satisfied. I'm really impressed with the build quality. Also, the internals on the RM1000i, I mean, we didn't really get into it. It's like, let's take it apart and take a look at it. But the engineering on the inside of the RM1000i is very, very good. Corsair has done some good work, or licensed some good stuff and made sure that people did their job, or ever how you want to look at it. But what you get with Corsair is the name and the warranty. It's like they're a huge seller or reseller of all-in-one liquid coolers. What do they bring to the table? It's like, well, engineering, quality control, all the stuff that you would expect from that, but also warranty and service, global company, that kind of thing. Those are pretty big selling points in my opinion, especially when you're dropping, if you got a 5960X, you dropped $1,000 on a CPU. A little overpriced in my opinion, but what are you going to do? So what about the warranties, you say? Well, on the H110i GTX it's 5 years, and on the RM1000i it's 7 years. Both of these also come with the cable necessary to interface the micro USB port on the devices to your motherboard. If you'd rather not use a USB header, or you can't for whatever reason, you can use one of the rubber grommets on your case to go outside the case. This is just a standard USB mini B type connection on both of these, so you could use just regular USB cables if you want. If you really wanted to be fancy, you could combine both of these into a single USB connector. So if you've got some of these, or you're thinking about getting some of these, or you have some experiences with Corsair that you want to share, you should head on over to the forums at techsyndicate.com. And for those of you that are on cross-platform saying, well, what about Linux support? On our forums, Linux Master 9 has put together a really nice guide on getting Corsair Link working on whatever Corsair devices that you have that support Corsair Link on Linux. It is sort of a multi-step process, and you do have to jump through some hoops, but you are able to get mostly full functionality of Corsair Link on Linux. There's a great post on the forums for that. Hopefully I'll remember to link it in the description. And then some guy named Master Sergeant Martin made a video on how to do this, although I haven't had a chance to look at it. So if it's really good, yay. If it's really bad, you should let him know, and then somebody should do a better job. All right. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you on the forums, hopefully in the Linux thread. You know, the funniest thing about the RM1000i, when I was talking to Johnny Guru about just power supplies in general, not the RM1000i specifically, but they're power supplies that don't spin the fan unless it needs to. They actually get a fairly high number of RMAs from people that don't realize the fan doesn't have to spin at relatively low wattages. It's like, no, I've got my components all loaded in. I've got my dual graphics card and my 5960X. The fan's not spinning. Clearly something is wrong. And it's like, well, no. The power has gotten to the point where if the devices are not doing anything, they're not drawing any power, because otherwise they would just be converting everything to heat and wasting energy. So even though you've got all the top shelf components, it really doesn't draw full wattage until you're actually doing something with the system, unless, at least in the case of the CPU, unless you've gone to the UEFI and disabled all the power management stuff and you know, you're overclocking it and you're doing all kinds of weird stuff and telling it that you want this voltage all the time. And then, yeah, the CPU will run at whatever wattage it's designed at for the whole time, basically continuously drawing some wattage. But even then, even if you turn all that on, when you actually do work with the computer, the wattage will still increase a small amount on the CPU side of things. But then for GPU and that sort of thing, with modern GPUs, with power management on the GPUs, there's not, unless you're just running a benchmark or something. So you really want to use something like AIDA64 to do those kind of tests and make sure that the fan comes on automatically when your wattage has exceeded a certain limit. And if you want to be really, really sure, you have to get a wall device like a kilowatt to measure your power draw at the wall to see what that is in order to confirm. That's a long story and probably nobody cares.